Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again for the next installment of our COVID-19 lecture series. We are extremely proud here at Elizabethtown College to be able to offer this series to our communities. As I stated, this is the second in our series. And next Wednesday on the 15th at 11, we will also be holding another event with Mr. Joel Janowitz, I don't know how to pronounce Joel's last name, Janowiczuski, who is from Student Services, who will have a fantastic presentation on activities and engagements that we can all be involved with during this particular crisis. Again, as I think all of you know, our college's motto is Educate for Service, and we're so proud and glad that we're able to offer this particular lecture series to our populations. Let me tell you a little bit about our presenters today. First, we'll hear from Dr. David Kenley, who is director of our Center for Global Understanding and Peacemaking. He's also a professor of Chinese history here at Elizabethtown College. He is an expert on Chinese migration and overseas identity, and his research has taken him all over the world. Committed to the concept of the scholar teacher, Dr. Kenley is the author of 3 books and dozens of scholarly articles, chapters, and reviews. Joining Dr. Kenley will be Dr. Jeff Bach, who is the director of our Young Center for Anabaptist and Pietist Studies here at the college, and he is also an associate professor in the Department of Religious Studies. In addition to his research interests in the history of Pietist and Anabaptist groups, he has researched to work on the Church of the Brethren missionaries in China from 1908 to 1951, and he and Dr. Kenley jointly led a study tour to China in 2018. Now, through this presentation, if you would like to ask questions, simply use the Q&A moniker that's on your computer, your laptop, or your iPad, and we'll hold a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. First, we'll hear from Dr. David Kenley. Then we'll hear from Dr. Jeff Bach. Then Dr. David Kenley will come back in with a few more comments and presentment. Then we'll hold our Q&A. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll now turn it over to Dr. David Kenley.
Thank you, Jesse. That was a very kind introduction. And Dr. Bach and I are both very glad you are joining us for today's presentation as part of the COVID-19 speaker series. None of us have ever lived through anything quite like this pandemic. It began earlier this year in China and is now wreaking havoc across the United States. Not surprisingly, there are a lot of unanswered questions regarding exposure rates, timetables, asymptomatic infections, economic recovery, and on and on. While we may not have all the answers to these questions, and while none of us have experienced such a pandemic before, there are historical antecedents with important lessons that may be applicable today. For the next few moments, we want to talk about an epidemic that swept through central China almost exactly 100 years ago, in 1917 and 1918. We will conclude by trying to apply a few lessons from that epidemic to our situation today. As a professor of Chinese studies, I am particularly interested in the ways in which today's pandemic is affecting the already problematic relations between the United States and China. The trade war has quickly escalated to name-calling, baseless accusations, and the severing of ties. Interestingly, both China and the US are currently led by 2 powerful populist leaders who are committed to substantially elevating each of their countries' standing in the international community. By all estimations, America's Donald Trump and China's Xi Jinping are transformational presidents. Perhaps not surprisingly, leaders of these 2 countries see the current COVID-19 pandemic quite differently. In the United States, politicians, journalists, and opinion leaders have repeatedly used the coronavirus to attack or at least discredit China. Within a few days of the outbreak in Wuhan, conspiracy theorists in the United States began using social media to suggest that the virus had been manufactured by the Chinese military in a biowarfare lab located in central China. Scientists and informed readers quickly dismissed such reports as wild internet rumors. but no less than Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas publicly repeated these, infuriating leaders in Beijing. President Trump has also sought to blame China for the virus. One photojournalist recently snapped an image of Trump's speaking notes. The photo clearly shows in Trump's own handwriting that the word coronavirus has been crossed out and replaced with the words Chinese virus. Asian Americans have accused Trump of race baiting with the term, and the popular late-night talk show host Trevor Noah took the opportunity to criticize Trump and many of his public apologists. Let me show you a quick video clip from the Daily Show with Trevor Noah.
President Trump doubled and tripled down on rejecting calling the disease COVID-19, instead calling it the Chinese virus.
Some important developments in our war against the Chinese virus.
From Wuhan is a virus from China that is a foreign virus.
Chinese coronavirus, the Wuhan virus.
Wuhan virus is a great idea.
607 cases of the Wuhan virus. Where did it originate? It originated in Wuhan, Hubei province, China, right?
Why do you keep using this? A lot of people say it's racist.
It comes from China. That's why. It comes from China. I want to be accurate.
If you'll let me just stop my screen share here a minute and restart it with a different setup so that we get better video quality from here on out. Besides politicians, journalists have also been highly critical of China during this pandemic. Op-ed writer Mark Thiessen recently penned an essay or an article for the Washington Post. He wrote, "Want to know why the US economy is in free fall? Why restaurants and bars are closing, putting millions out of work? And why the airline industry is facing possible bankruptcy? Why schools across the nation are shutting down, leaving students to fall behind and parents without safe places to send their children every day? Why the stock market is plummeting, wiping out the retirement and college savings of millions of Americans? Why the elderly are isolated in nursing homes and tens of millions who don't have the option of teleworking have no idea how they will pay their bills?" The answer, it's the Chinese Communist Party's fault. If you were like me, you were thinking, wow, that's a lot of blame to place on another nation's government. As a historian, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that this is hardly the first time Americans have attacked Asians as carriers of pathogens. When Chinese immigrants arrived in the United States in the 19th century, journalists and labor union leaders quickly denounced them as unsuitable for American culture. As Nyan Shah shows in his work, Contagious Divides, public health authorities in particular depicted Chinese immigrants as filthy and diseased, as the carriers of such incurable afflictions as smallpox, syphilis, and bubonic plague. This resulted in the vociferous enforcement of sanitary regulations on the Chinese community. In an attempt to control the supposed spread of these diseases, immigrants were forced into undesirable ghettos, which quickly became known as Chinatowns. Lacking such basic infrastructural urban investments as running water, sewage, and trash collection, Chinatown residents responded with persuasive political speeches, lawsuits, boycotts, and protests. Chinese American activists drew upon public health strategies in their advocacy for health services and public housing. Adroitly employing discourses of race and health, these activists argued that Chinese Americans were worthy and deserving of sharing in the resources, of American society. On the other side of the Pacific, Chinese politicians, journalists, and opinion leaders have also used the coronavirus to attack, or at least discredit, the United States. For instance, on March 18th, the Chinese government expelled several American journalists from China, accusing them of exploiting the viral outbreak to whip up anti-Chinese sentiment. Stunningly, they also charged the United States government of hypocritically suppressing political expression and violating freedom of the press. And much like Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton, officials in China have accused the US military of creating and releasing the virus as a biological weapon of mass destruction. According to China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the coronavirus is, and I quote, an American disease that might have been introduced by the United States Army, who visited Wuhan in October. Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian accused the US of not coming clean about what they know about the disease. Despite all of this coronavirus ugliness between China and the United States, the two countries do have more positive historical experiences from which to learn. For the next few minutes, Dr. Jeff Bach is going to tell us about a pneumonic plague that swept central China in 1917 and 1918. Dr. Bach, please take us back to this more cooperative time when Brethren missionaries worked side by side with their Chinese colleagues in addressing this earlier pandemic.
Thank you, Dr. Kenley. I want to thank the planners of this lecture series for the honor, the opportunity to tell this story. A very different story of a lethal disease and American and Chinese cooperation instead of antagonism unfolded about a century ago when the pneumonic plague broke out in northern China in 1917 and 1918. Brethren missionaries were in China, and they were among many who responded to the crisis. The Church of the Brethren is a small Protestant denomination that began in 1708 in Germany. They practiced adult baptism and communion by observing a love feast with feet washing and a love meal and the bread and cup of communion. Like other Anabaptist groups, they were pacifists, and they believed in mutual discipline, and the ethic of service was very important to them from the beginning. Between 1719 and 1740, almost all of the Brethren, a few hundred in number, immigrated to Pennsylvania, where they have grown in this country. Initially, the Brethren were opposed to higher education for fear that it would lead to vanity and pride. But in the 1870s, the Brethren began to start some colleges. Eventually, 6 would survive. Elizabethtown College is one of those founded by Brethren people, and it was the last one started in 1899. The Brethren were equally opposed to foreign missions originally, but in the 1870s, they began starting mission endeavors just like colleges. In 1876, they went to Denmark. In 1895, a group started a mission field in India. And then in 1908, a group of 5 Brethren missionaries went to China. In 1910, they had settled in the eastern part of Shanxi province, a north-central province of China. They opened their first station in 1910 in Pingding, and in 1912, they opened a second station in Laozhou, 75 miles south of Pingding. When they began their mission, they went to share their faith, to share education, and to do some limited medical work. Between 1908 and 1951, 94 Brethren missionaries went to China. 60, that is about roughly 2/3 of them, were women. And of those 60 women, 27, almost half, were single women. And only one single man went as a missionary to China. Shanxi province, where they located, had been an important banking center, but by the late 19th century, it was largely agricultural and rural, with coal mining as an important industry in the southern part of the province. The governor of Shanxi province, Yan Shan, who began to rule in 1912, was very favorable to modernization and supportive of Western ideas, and was willing to work with the missionaries who came into his province. The Brethren missionaries petitioned for more medical help in 1913. They asked the mission board in the US to send doctors. One of the missionaries, B.F. Heckman, had died in 1913 from a smallpox vaccination that failed. He and his 2 daughters were inoculated against the disease, and for the daughters, it was successful. Unfortunately, the dosage that Mr. Heckman received was faulty. He contracted the disease and died. So in 1914, 2 doctors and their wives came to China. Dr. Ora Brubaker and his wife Cora, and Dr. Fred Wampler and his wife Rebecca arrived in China that year. The Brubakers went to Laozhou in the south, and the Wamplers stayed in Pingding. Dr. Wampler began to improve the medical services in Pingding, and in 1950, a small rudimentary hospital opened to serve the medical needs of the Chinese people. Within 2 years, they faced an enormous crisis that they could not have anticipated. And we'll look at the next picture that's in the PowerPoint presentation there. When the plague broke out in 1917, many families fled their villages trying to find safe places to live. And this is an illustration of some of those people. In the next picture, we'll see a photo of Dr. Fred Wampler in a protective suit that he designed for use when visiting potential patients. Here he's preparing a slide to diagnose a patient for whether they have the pneumonic plague. Pneumonic plague is caused by a bacterium and not by a virus like the current novel coronavirus. Pneumonic plague affects the lungs, and it's nearly 100% fatal if not treated in a short time. You might recognize the name of plague as similar to the bubonic plague. It's a related disease that ravaged Western Europe in the Middle Ages, and sometimes it was called the Black Death. Pneumonic plague affects the lungs, but bubonic plague affects the lymph nodes. There's a third related disease, the septicemic plague, that affects the bloodstream. Pneumonic plague, like I said, is spread through droplets in the air. It's short-lived, unlike the coronavirus, and so Dr. Wampler learned that simple techniques of isolation and wearing masks could halt the spread of the plague. Although the plague is caused by a bacterium and can now be treated by antibiotics, that wasn't an option in 1917. The pneumonic plague is not a Chinese disease, just like the novel coronavirus is not a Chinese disease. Chinese people did not generate either disease. The pneumonic plague has occurred many times through the centuries in many parts of the world, and it's not limited to any one ethnic background. The current novel coronavirus is also a global illness and affects people of many different backgrounds. So before I say more about Dr. Fred Wampler's work, I'd like to ask Dr. Kenley to come back on. I'd be curious about his impressions of what the Chinese might have thought about the Brethren and their approach to medicine when they arrived in Shanxi.
That's a great question, and I don't want to take too much time away from your presentation, but Western medicine had been introduced into China in the late 19th century, and many Chinese were initially suspicious, but had eventually come to understand that Western medicine had a lot to offer in terms of public health. In Shanxi province, this was somewhat isolated, further from the large cities of the coast, and therefore a lot of Dr. Wampler's methods and practices would have certainly been novel to a lot of people that he ran into. He would have needed some help of local cultural interpreters, so to speak, if his medical activities were going to be very effective.
Hey, thank you very much. Dr. Fred Wampler was born near Bridgewater, Virginia in 1883. He studied at Bridgewater College, and then he went to medical school at Rush Medical College of the University of Chicago. He earned his MD in 1913. Later, he earned a master's degree in public health from the School of Hygiene and Public Health at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Fred and Rebecca Wampler were in China from 1914 to 1926, and the photos that are shown during my part of the presentation come from a collection of photos he took during that time. In 1926, the Wamplers came home from China, and their only son, Fred, was 2 years old at the time. In 1916, Dr. Wampler received an able reinforcement, a woman named Betty Ryder. She arrived as a nurse to help in the Brethren Hospital. She was a graduate of Elizabethtown College in 1903 from the commercial department. She was in the first class of Elizabethtown students to graduate. After her graduation, she felt called to do mission work. She studied at the Brethren Bible School, Bethany, in Chicago, and she also earned an RN, a registered nurse degree. She arrived in China in 1916 and served until 1920. When she came back, she eventually married Professor Jacob Harley, who taught English and German at Elizabethtown College. Because the pneumonic plague is spread by droplets and no antibiotics were available, Dr. Wampler used the low-tech strategies of distancing and isolation and the use of face masks to help prevent the spread of the plague. And in the next picture, you'll see how these strategies were used for workers who went out to villages to control the outbreak of the plague. The workers went out with the authority of Governor Yan Shan, and so as they introduced quarantine measures and required people to wear masks, they did so with the governor's authority behind them. The workers who went out on these patrols were a combination of Chinese workers as well as some of the American missionary workers. One of the worst problems for the spread of the plague was the treatment of the victims' bodies. Sometimes entire families died in houses and they were left in the homes where they died without burial. Unfortunately, sometimes wild animals would dig up bodies that were buried in only shallow graves. And then when the animals dragged body parts to new areas, that would spread the plague germ as well. And so Dr. Wampler developed these protective suits so that the patrols could go out and collect bodies and bury them at a proper depth to stop the spread from corpses. He also developed extensive protocols for washing and disinfecting when the workers took off their suits. In the next picture, you'll see a group of the sanitation corps, the sanitary corps, as they're preparing for burial detail. In addition to the Chinese workers, the Brethren also collaborated with other medical staff from other missions. Dr. Preston Maxwell from the Peking Union Medical College and Dr. Willoughby Hemingway from Taegu from the American Board Hospital were helpers with Dr. Wampler. You might recognize the name Hemingway. Willoughby Hemingway was indeed Ernest Hemingway's uncle. When the medical workers, including the doctors as well as these sanitation patrols, would go to the villages, they would assess how far the plague had spread and instruct people in measures of sanitation. Dr. Wampler took special pride that none of the workers on these sanitary patrols ever contracted the disease. In the next slide, you'll see a picture of a large celebration that Governor Yan Shan hosted to celebrate the successful end of the plague in Shanxi province. And in the picture, you see the large group of both Chinese and American international workers In the front, the woman who is seated at the center is Rebecca Wampler. And as you look at the picture, to her right is Dr. Frederick Wampler. He's not wearing his protective suit in this picture. In the next picture, we'll see some of the ongoing work of the Brethren to continue training doctors and nurses after the outbreak of the pneumonic plague. In this photo, Dr. Han is the man who is second from the left, and the other three men are nurses, and they are standing at the Brethren Hospital in Pingding. The men who were trained to assist the doctors in the hospital went on to earn medical degrees in Beijing, and then came back to Shanxi province to treat people in that area. The Brethren Hospital and the hospital in Laozhou continued to train nurses and graduated many groups. These Chinese people helped to operate the hospitals in collaboration with American workers. And after the Brethren missionaries left, they continued to operate healthcare facilities. The Brethren lived out the values that they brought with them of service to help the concrete human needs of people. And Nurse Betty Ryder was a very good example of the college's motto, Educate for Service, in her work as a nurse there. Unfortunately, in the next picture, you'll see a picture of the nursing class, one of the nursing classes that graduated a few years after Fred Wampler was there. Unfortunately, the pneumonic plague was not the only crisis that the Brethren faced. Just within a year of the end of the pneumonic plague, a series of dry summers resulted in crop failure and a widespread famine in northern China. The Brethren again cooperated with Governor Yan's government and also with international workers to develop famine relief programs. Working with the provincial government and with the International Red Cross, the Brethren created a project to build an 80-mile road that connected Pingding with Laozhou in the south. And Dr. Fred Wampler was appointed to be the director of that entire project. Laborers would work on the road and receive food rations for themselves and food rations that were given to their families as well. The road created the first major modern road that connected the northern and southern parts of Shanxi and allowed for travel back and forth. Unfortunately, while the famine relief project was underway, in 1920, there was also an outbreak of cholera. And so during the years that Dr. Fred Wampler was in China and other doctors were working there, they faced many crises, and at each point, the Americans worked collaboratively with Chinese medical and government officials to try to treat and limit the diseases as much as possible. Dr. Wampler remained a strong advocate not only of relief, but also public health education the rest of his life, and had a distinguished career in the United States after he returned. Some of the takeaways from this experience for the Brethren are shown in the next slide. The Brethren learned that collaboration across religious lines was essential. They also found out that anti-plague efforts needed to include Chinese workers and medical personnel as well as international workers. The cooperation with the Shanxi government was vital for the success. Without the support and authority of Governor Yan, they would not have come to such a successful outcome. Another important insight is that Brethren doctors and nurses continued to train Chinese people for medical work that included Chinese doctors and nurses, and that work continued after the Brethren left. Another important learning from this experience was that the low-tech measures of distancing and quarantine and the use of face masks were highly effective in stopping the plague when people followed those measures properly. Dr. Kenley is going to add some more insights to this, this event and what we can learn from it today.
Thank you, Dr. Bach. Dr. Bach and I have been working on studying this period in Chinese history for the last several years, and it has been insightful and invigorating, and I've thoroughly enjoyed my collaboration with him. Just one minor correction, Dr. Bach, if you don't mind.
Yes.
I think it was Bessie Ryder, not Betty Ryder.
Oh my goodness, you're right. It's Bessie. Betty, if you're listening, I apologize.
Betty Ryder is our current vice president, and perhaps she's related to Bessie. Who knows? Let's find out. Thank you, Dr. Bach.
Thank you for catching that, Dr. Kenley. Yes, it's Bessie Ryder.
So I want to conclude by talking about what are the lessons that we can now apply to the situation today. What is it that the brethren experience in China can do to help us understand the 2020 pandemic? I invite each of you to answer that question for yourself and be prepared to share your takeaways with us in a few moments during the open Q&A session. For now, however, let me share 4 possible lessons as I see them. First, epidemics demand cooperation, coordination, and the sharing of resources. In our current geopolitical climate, there simply has not been enough of these. At the same time, let's not overlook the areas of cooperation that have taken place this spring. For example, Chinese scientists were the first to map the genome sequence of COVID-19. Dozens of pharmaceutical companies from around the world are investing huge amounts of money in a race to develop a vaccine. And yet, the Chinese scientists released the genome sequence on an open platform and shared it with other scientists from around the world. I look forward to hearing from our biologists in this speaker series, as they will help us better understand the significance of this very cooperative endeavor. In more recent days, China has sent thousands of ventilators to Italy and several container ships of supplies to the US. And the US has been generous as well. Instead of sending empty planes to China to retrieve US citizens stranded there, Washington first filled those aircraft with 18 tons of medical supplies for China's doctors and nurses heroically fighting the spread of the disease. The United States also pledged $100 million in aid to China and other nations to fight the virus. Unfortunately, such acts of cooperation and compassion too often get overlooked in a climate of suspicion and acrimony. Second, and this goes along with cooperation, each nation must act with transparency and trust. Trump calls COVID-19 the China virus, in part because he believes the Chinese withheld valuable information about the disease, and therefore the US underestimated its potential impact. In just the past few days, as the US death toll has surpassed China's, many Americans are again accusing China of lying over the total number of deaths. For a US president fixated on numbers, such fights over death rates seem incredibly distasteful. Nor are the Chinese completely blameless. No doubt Chinese officials did initially try to cover up the severity of the outbreak. Dr. Li Wenliang first began warning his friends and family members of a new dangerous disease around the turn of this new year. Officials forced him to recount his statement because they said it was causing public unrest. Later, Dr. Li contracted the virus and died himself, thus becoming a hero among Chinese intellectuals for daring to speak out. Furthermore, when the US offered to send representatives of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Chinese authorities rebuffed the offer, saying they were more than prepared to handle the outbreak themselves. Today, we are all paying the price for this lack of transparency and trust between the two nations. Just really quickly, this is an image of Dr. Li Wenliang. There was a very famous photograph of him taken wearing a face mask. And after his death, some insightful Chinese cartoonist drew this cartoon and transformed the face mask, as you can see, into barbed wire, kind of highlighting the Chinese attempts to silence him and anyone else who would supposedly disrupt public order. Third, I think we need to recognize our interdependence. Why are we facing a shortage of face masks? Quite simply because we buy all of our face masks from China, and the Chinese currently need all the face masks that they can produce. We are seeing similar problems with ventilators. The typical ventilator is built from components manufactured all over the world. We cannot make them ourselves in time to address this pandemic. Why are we out of toilet paper? Because some prefer hoarding for themselves rather than considering the good of society as a whole. And yet, despite our interdependence, isolation and quarantines are sometimes the best options we have. Right now, the socially responsible thing to do is to withdraw from social interaction. Rather than blame each other for our predicament, let us use technology like Zoom, Facebook, and Instagram to mitigate the worst byproducts of social distancing. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, I think it is important to remember that petty nationalism has no role to play in times of global pandemic. Viruses do not recognize international borders. Today, we are all truly global citizens. The Brethren missionaries and their Chinese colleagues exemplified this attitude. Missionaries can perhaps be described as early versions of today's NGOs. Doctors Without Borders and other such institutions have a vital role to play in our world. I challenge each of you listening to put aside your nationalism, at least for the next few weeks, and realize our universal fraternity. As they say in Chinese, 四海之内皆兄弟也, which translates as, from across the four seas, we all are brothers. Last year, Dr. Bach and I took a group of students to China to visit the sites of the former Brethren missionaries. Our Chinese host for this visit was Dr. Li, the chief physician and administrator of a new hospital recently built in Pingding. As Dr. Li was planning for the hospital construction, he learned of the previous Brethren missionaries that had worked in the region. The last missionary left Pingding in the late 1940s, long before Dr. Li was born. Nevertheless, he was impressed with these missionaries and with their willingness to work side by side with their Chinese colleagues in promoting public health. When it came time to choose a name for his newly constructed hospital, Dr. Li called it the Yo-Ai Hospital, or in English, the Brethren Hospital. As you may suspect, Dr. Li and his staff were gracious, generous hosts to us and our students. In many ways, I feel that this hospital should be a symbol of U.S.-China cooperation during this time of global pandemic. I hope these don't sound like trite, simplistic lessons. This is a complex crisis that is testing the abilities of our brightest epidemiologists, economists, biologists, and sociologists. At the same time, let's not overlook the most obvious lessons we can learn from the past. China and the United States represent the two largest economies in the world. They represent two of the three most populous nations in the world. If we survive this pandemic, and of course I know we will need to continue finding creative ways to work together for the betterment of our global community. Thank you very much for participating. Thank you for your comments and your insights, Dr. Bach, and I'm going to turn it back over to Professor Jesse Waters.
Drs. Bach and Kenley, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. That was passionate, informative, really just a wonderful presentation. So we've got some really fantastic questions here. And I think the first one, perhaps if Dr. Bach, you could take this one. how effective were the protective suits that those brethren and other missionaries wore during that time in China? Did they have knowledge of which materials prevented the spread of disease and which materials didn't?
The first part of that answer, my answer goes to your last part of your question. They really didn't have a lot of choices about what material to use. But what they did do is put on multiple layers. The suits had multiple layers, and then they were washed thoroughly in between uses. The suits that you saw in the photos were what they used when they were out in public. In the hospital, they used traditional medical clothing with surgical suits or nursing suits over the top, and then smaller masks that would have covered their faces. And this amount of protective gear was very, very effective in stopping the virus. The droplets didn't carry the germ in a live form very long once they left the human body, although the corpses remained kind of breeding material for the germs. So the protective suits were relatively low tech. They didn't have any choices for what to use, but it was very effective. Dr. Wampler wrote in an article that was published in the China Medical Journal in 1924 that when people observed quarantine and wore masks, they were able to reduce the amount of infection within 4 days. And if everyone continued to observe those measures, the disease could be eliminated from a village in 7 days. Obviously, that's a lot different than the coronavirus because the germ is very different. But it does explain why Shanxi and the international team had such great success in stopping the pneumonic plague.
And connected to that, Dr. Bach, how did this area respond, or how was it affected by the 1918 influenza pandemic?
Actually, the best I know, but Dr. Kenley can add a footnote here, the best I know is that the influenza outbreak was not nearly so strong. They were really overwhelmed by the pneumonic plague in this part of China.
That's correct. The 1918 influenza pandemic was especially devastating in India and Southeast Asia, and there were parts of southwest China, Sichuan province, that were affected by the influenza pandemic. But fortunately, where the brethren were located in north central China, they escaped the worst effects of the more famous 1918 influenza pandemic.
So, Dr. Kenley, perhaps this is a question you could field for us. With the overall recovery seen recently in China, do you think the initial blaming of China for the coronavirus is impeding the U.S. from mirroring China's recovery efforts? Or do you think that's more of an issue with the U.S.'s cooperation within our own current health guidelines?
Good question. It seems to me whoever asked that question probably they've telegraphed their answer to it. And I do think that there's a lot of cultural chauvinism and belief that what happened in China could never be replicated here, either in terms of worst case scenarios or in terms of public control methods. Ironically, both the United States and China have a long history of a belief in exceptionalism, that somehow what goes on in China is different from anywhere else in the world, or that what goes on in the United States is exceptional and different from anywhere else in the world. The two countries, I would argue, have a long history of unwillingness to learn from the good and bad examples of others. Good question.
So this is a question perhaps for either of our speakers today, and it comes back to the use of this adjective Chinese. And I think this is a very interesting question because I think, as we know, we have ethnic and racial and nationalist adjectives in front of all sorts of nouns in our culture. So the question we have here is, if this disease had started elsewhere, do you think that the president or that the people of the United States would be as apt to calling the virus something like the Chinese virus?
Jeff, you want to take that, or you want me to?
I think we both should, but I'll start, then you can clean up after me. Well, the big influenza epidemic in 1918 was sometimes called the Spanish flu, but it obviously was not Spanish. It was a germ, and it may have first appeared in Spain, but I would say probably the taxonomy of where it originated might be uncertain, really. And perhaps that's the case with corona. I don't know. It'd be interesting to see what our biologists say in their lecture. So personally, I think it would depend on what country this disease might be attributed to and what the United States' outlook is. I think in the popular journalism and among some of our political leaders, it's been a way to put in another little dig at China, since we were already in a trade war with China when it broke out. If it had broken out in Hungary, I'm not sure it would be called the Hungarian virus. So I think probably part of the predisposition to assign a national name comes from the outlook of our leaders at the time it broke out. That's my opinion.
Thank you.
This is irrelevant to the question, but it's just an interesting sidebar. One of the reasons it's called the Spanish flu was because the flu broke out in various countries of Europe, but this was the middle of World War I, and many of the countries fighting in the war were censoring their press and didn't want their adversaries to realize that the flu was ravishing their own troops. And so the reports coming out of Germany and England were censored. Spain, which was not involved in the war, didn't have the same level of press censorship. And so they were publishing accounts of deaths as a result of this flu. And most historians say that's why it's called the Spanish flu. It has nothing to do with where it originated. It has to do with press censorship in the other countries of Europe.
Interesting.
Would we call it Chinese flu or Spanish flu today? Well, obviously we are calling it the Spanish, or we are calling it the Chinese virus. I'm thinking back more recently, just not too long ago, when we had the Ebola outbreak in Western Africa. And I think the press tended to treat that as something that was uniquely African and therefore was of no concern to America, that it would not happen here. Our president referred to some of those countries, as you remember, as, pardon my French, but shithole countries. Yeah, I think there's some sharp antagonism between the United States and China right now, but I think we have a long history of blaming other countries for our epidemics.
And I think it's fascinating, not to go down this rabbit hole, but just considering the linguistic sort of semiotic or symbolic representation. For example, you saying, pardon my French. You know, these things really are embedded in our culture at levels and reactions that sometimes we're not even conscious of. And when we're faced with crises like these, often those things kind of surface in ways that we have to confront them. Let me move on to our next question, because I think it really is a fascinating one. We have the question here, going back to that Brethren engagement in China at the turn of the century. Were there any concerns from the Chinese regarding the religious aspects of Westerners being in the country, especially because of a potentially historically tumultuous relationship with Christianity?
Well, I think we should both take an answer on that too, but I'll start once again. So at the time the Brethren arrived in 1908, China was going through a lot of tumultuous conflict. There had been the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, in which many Christian missionaries lost their lives because China was reacting to a long history of Western attempts to dominate and impose political control in China. And Christianity was associated with that political involvement. And in many cases, that was warranted. And then the collapse of the empire resulted in more political unrest, and that's about the time the Brethren were starting in Shanxi province. And on the heels of that, there was, and Dr. Kenley can say this more clearly than I, there was a kind of reaction against the empire. And so for some people, there was a little bit of openness to Western ways, as was the case with Governor Yan Xishan, because they thought that was the way to shed off the encumbrances of the old empire. And in some ways, it created for some a little bit of an openness to Western ideas. There were a lot of Chinese people at the time of the plague outbreak in 1917 who blamed the plague on evil spirits. And that would be a kind of traditional indigenous religious response. There have been times in Western countries where Christianity dominated, where diseases have been blamed on evil spirits as well. So that's nothing confined to China or any other country, non-Western country. And then, of course, there had been missionaries in China for a long time by the time the Brethren got there. So I think there were mixed attitudes. There's a lot of suspicion against the Western missionaries because they dressed so different, they looked so different, and they had different patterns of family organization. They certainly ate different foods as well. And so it's partly the religion and partly the cultural difference that was a difficulty. However, for the Brethren people, the folks of Shanxi realized ultimately that the Brethren were trying to be helpful, even though they weren't very culturally understanding when they arrived. And the Brethren people themselves changed over the time while they were there. And their first attitudes that sometimes come across a little as superior in some of their early letters really give way to a lot better attempt to understand the Chinese culture, even as they were sharing their faith and their service too. I'd be interested to hear what Dr. Kenley says.
I was just going to mention the Boxer Rebellion, and the Brethren were very aware of the potential violence against Christian missionaries. No, I think you've stated it very well, Dr. Bach.
Okay, so we'll take a few more questions here. What is it about politics today that has geared our attacks against foreign government rather than dealing with the pandemic cooperatively? How were the Brethren able to get past their particular political ideologies or hurdles and do this positive work there in China?
Well, I'll start, and again, if Dr. Kenley wants to add, that's fine. When the Brethren went, they went already having a long heritage since their beginning of being not partisan. Because they were persecuted in Europe, they were not really aggressively in favor of endorsing any kind of political structure. During the Revolutionary War, the Brethren were mistreated for being pacifists, and some of the same things happened in the Civil War era. So unlike many Christian traditions in the U.S., the Brethren always had kept a little bit of distance because they'd had previous unhappy experiences with governments. And so they weren't prepared to take a kind of partisan political view on anything there. And they were always looking to see with whom they could cooperate best to advance what they wanted to do in the mission. So there was more openness and flexibility that helped them bypass getting locked up into political loyalties just because of their past experiences.
And the second part of that question, what ramifications does this have for our current political climate? Man, that's the million-dollar question, right? I don't think it's new that we tend to blame outsiders and foreigners for our own challenges and problems. The question really is how do we move beyond that in some meaningful way? And how do we move our politics beyond that in some meaningful way? great question for maybe Fletcher McClellan last week.
So I think we'll take one more question. As I think all of us have seen today, our presentation today focuses on kind of two things. What's going on in our country currently, either rhetorically or actively, in terms of people's engagement with this crisis, and then also the history of the Brethren and their involvement in China during a period that was very similar to this, roughly 100 years ago. What's going on right now in the Brethren community in terms of their thoughts and feelings, and perhaps also actions and engagements during this crisis? And perhaps, Dr. Bach, might you be able to give us a little bit of insight in terms of how our Amish and Pietist communities are dealing with this particular crisis? And then, of course, because again, our mission is educate for service, are there any things that we can be aware of in terms of what the Brethren are doing or what's going on in our Amish communities that just being aware of could empower us to make potential contributions or to share those things in our own communities?
I think Brethren are very much in gear with all of the efforts to provide service and relief as best as they can. And I don't think that there's anything uniquely Brethren happening there. Brethren are strongly encouraging people to keep social distance and not to hold worship services. And in this week of Easter, when many congregations would be holding love feasts that involve feet washing and sitting close together to eat and breaking bread and drinking from the fruit of the vine. Those things are tough to let go of. Same would be true for Jewish people who will be missing out on Seders, and there are probably other religions that I'm not as well informed about that would have special events in this season. So in that sense, I don't know that the Brethren are necessarily unique, but those would be things that they're doing. And related to that would be efforts to come up with supplies that can be helpful. We get a lot of advice not to hoard, and that's a good thing. I don't know how well it's being followed. And I think today the Brethren, maybe much like they were 100 years ago, we're really seeing their place as players alongside other people in trying to respond to this, and certainly, taking a lead to the extent that's possible for a very small denomination. So it's a combination of both of those things, and I don't know that there's anything truly unique about the Brethren response right now. There's also a lot of advice to try to see past a lot of the public speech and publicity that assigns blame. In terms of the Amish, I'm not really very informed. I'm not very much up to date on what the Amish are up to. That'd be a good question to get Steve Nolt to come in as a guest visitor. It's very difficult for the Amish because even more so than the Brethren, they do a lot up close and together. But I do know a lot of Amish are trying to recommend that families keep distances and follow the guidelines because they don't want a public reputation to grow up that will reflect ill on the Amish. But it is difficult because when funerals happen or weddings happen, the natural response for the Amish is to gather in their large communities. And I know they're trying to avoid that when they can.
Okay. Well, Drs. Bach and Kenley, thank you so much for this presentation. We're really just grateful. What a fantastic presentment, really informative and passionate and really along the lines of helping us be aware of not only what we can be thinking of in our own communities currently, but being aware of how our communities have dealt with this in the past. Really just a fantastic presentation. Thank you both so much. And I'd also like to extend a great thanks to those folks behind the scenes, Brian Helm, Linda McCauley, Jill Petronio, their entire staff. They have worked endlessly and with such great passion and energy to help make this lecture series happen. We are just absolutely grateful to them. And to let all of us know, Joel Januszewski, who is our Director of Purposeful Life Pathways and Civic Participation Center for Community and Civic Engagement, will be offering our next installment next Wednesday on the 15th at 11 o'clock. And this, I think, is really going to be a fantastic presentation. Staying out of the deep end, community engagement in the midst of social distancing. So here we all are, addicted to our Netflix and our Hulu and our cell phones, perhaps wondering what it is that we can do to still experience togetherness, either with this technology or outside of this technology. So we really hope very much that you'll join us for that presentation. Also, if you have questions for our presenters that we weren't able to answer, please feel free to send them by email to writershouse@etown.edu, and we'll pass those off to our experts to create even more community for answering these questions and getting to issues that we know you're concerned about. As I said last week, not only is our mission educate for service, but we serve to educate. And it is these lecture series that we really feel can bring our communities together and offer something unique. So I'm Jesse Waters, director of the Bowers Writers House, signing off for all of us here at Elizabethtown College. We're grateful for your participation and your engagement, and we so look forward to you being a part of our future lecture series.